So there's 12 big plot mistakes that you might be making in your fantasy novel. After teaching over 200 fantasy writers in my different programs, I've seen these issues so many times, and I've spent hundreds of hours helping writers fix them. And after publishing 4 fantasy books myself, I've had to learn how to identify and fix these issues in my own writing as well. I also just recently finished the first draft of Plotting Your Fantasy Novel, which is a 150,000 word non-fiction book for writers. So I think about plotting a lot. Today, I'll show you how to identify and fix these 12 plot mistakes so that you can write a fantasy story that readers love. To explain the first big plot mistake, let's imagine that you want your protagonist to gain a strange magical power. In your early draft, maybe your protagonist is a farmer, and while she is just going out on her daily walk through the woods, she happens to slip down a hill and fall into an ancient temple where she's hit with this dose of arcane energy, giving her this magical ability. Okay, that scenario could work, but because you're kind of using coincidence to create this outcome, it's going to feel like a stroke of luck. And this can be fine early on in your story to set things up. But the further we get into your plot, the more annoyed readers will be if they see that you're relying too heavily on coincidences. So how would you fix this? Well, your protagonist is a farmer, right? So maybe one night there is a huge storm and it breaks down the fence of her goat pen. So a bunch of her goats, they flee from the farm, they run out into the forest. Now your protagonist has a choice. Does she wait until conditions clear before going out to try and rescue the goats? Or does she brave the storm, brave the rain, brave the lightning to go out and try to bring these goats back? She cares too much about these goats to wait, so she runs out into the night, and while she's searching for the goats in this forest, then she slips down the hill and falls into the ancient tomb and gets hit with a dose of arcane energy. You've just taken us to the exact same plot outcome, but it feels much more interesting. Why? Well, because the outcome is a consequence of a decision that your protagonist made. It results from a meaningful choice and action by the protagonist rather than just a stroke of luck. And so that's why the first big plot mistake that you want to be avoiding is using coincidence to move things forward in your story. It is much better to ask yourself, how can I use consequences instead? When you do that, you're going to have a stronger plot. Now, this second plot mistake is probably the biggest one that I made as a new fantasy writer. It messed up my first book massively, and it meant I had to actually rewrite that novel from scratch twice. So if you can avoid this mistake, it's going to save you a lot of headache. What's the mistake? Well, it's going to sound a little strange when I first explain it to you, but bear with me. The mistake is writing your story from the start. Let me explain what I mean by sharing a somewhat embarrassing personal story here. So the first novel I wrote was a middle grade superhero story called The Aeon Academy. I started writing it when I was 14. But here's the thing. I thought that writers just sat down, typed chapter 1, and just went from there, making the story up as they went along. So that's what I did. I just made things up as I went along, and I had a lot of fun in the process. Then I came to this point where I realized, I've sure written a lot of words. Maybe this book should get wrapped up soon. Oh, and I actually haven't really introduced a villain yet. So I introduced an antagonist, I came up with a climax kind of out of nowhere, and maybe around 15,000 words later, I finished the story. But when I looked back at the whole manuscript, my heart sunk. See, the ending, it just came out of nowhere. As a result, the story lacked cohesion. Heck, my villain only came into the book a few chapters from the end, and that wasn't me trying to write a clever twist. It was just because I'd only come up with the villain a few weeks before finishing the story. So when I started writing my next book, Across the Broken Stars, I was determined not to make the same mistake. I came up with my ending early on. Then I worked my way backwards from that ending when I was planning the story so that I could build to a really satisfying climax. And unlike The Aeon Academy, Across the Broken Stars was later published. And based on reader reviews, most people seem to really like the ending. So that right there is the power of working backwards from your ending. Now, I know you might be thinking, but Jed, I really don't like the idea of outlining or planning my story. Well, first of all, I do highly suggest outlining. I am a big fan. For me, it has been transformative for my own writing, and I have a whole video over here breaking down my outlining process in extensive detail. But even if you don't like outlining, it is really useful to just roughly know where your ending is going. You can always adjust things as you write, but you should know this. Your ending has the biggest emotional impact on your readers. You can have an okay story with an amazing ending, and it will be an amazing story. On the other hand, you can have an amazing story with a crappy ending, and it's going to be a crappy story. Your ending has such a huge weight on the reader's final thoughts about your story. And when you work backwards from your ending, you'll find it so much easier to make your ending great. For instance, if you know that your character is going to make this really selfless, brave decision in the climax, then you can work backwards from that and set them up to be a very cowardly and selfish person at the start of the story, which then creates this fantastic character arc for them to go through. Now, the third common plot mistake that you might be struggling with is not knowing how to flow and link between your scenes. When I surveyed over 300 fantasy writers in preparation for plotting your fantasy novel, this was one of the biggest plot issues that a lot of them struggled with. The answer is to understand scene structure. I like to think about my stories in terms of action scenes and response scenes. This is my personal modification of Dwight V. Swain's scene and sequel structure, which he talks about in Techniques of the Selling Writer. Now, an action scene focuses on pursuit, struggle, and change. And action scenes have 3 steps. First, the goal. What does your character want? Next, the conflict. What's stopping them from getting what they want? And then third, the resolution. As a result of the goal and conflict, what happens? By comparison, response scenes focus on emotion, reflection, and transition. A response scene also has 3 steps. You've got the reaction. So how does your character feel about the resolution that just happened at the end of the previous action scene? You've got the dilemma. What choice do they now face? And then lastly, you have the decision. What is the new goal that your character picks? And a great plot is simply just a chain of action and response scenes looping one after another, all the way from the start to the end of your story. And by the way, the lengths of these different phases are flexible. You could have a reaction phase that spans for 5 chapters. So maybe your character has just lost their best friend. You might have 5 chapters of them just contemplating and dealing with the emotional fallout of this. Or your reaction phase might be 1 sentence. You might be in the middle of this kind of pitched fight, and your character only really has 1 sentence to emotionally process something that happens. I talk about this scene structure in much more detail inside Plotting Your Fantasy Novel because there's a lot of nuance here and there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with this structure. So if you want to be emailed when the book is published, which hopefully won't be long now, just go to jedherne.com/plot. The book covers a lot of things that I've never discussed in these YouTube videos before, and it really gives you this cohesive framework for developing a great plot for your fantasy story. But just to give a little bit more depth on scene structure here so that you can really understand how to use this, let's go through a quick example right now. Let's say that our protagonist is a young sorceress, and the goal she has for this scene is trying to convince her mentor, who is this elderly witch, to teach her how to use a spell that lets her fly. But the conflict here is that her mentor doesn't think she's ready for this spell yet. Her mentor tells her, you should just stick to studying the books and studying the theory. You're not ready for this magic yet. So the resolution of this scene is, frustrated with her mentor, our protagonist tries to learn the spell herself, and it leads to her just floating away above the cabin in the woods where she's staying with her mentor. So her reaction here is, as she floats away into the sky from her mentor's cabin, she feels terrified. She's worried that she's just going to float off into the sky and die. This creates her dilemma. Does she shout out and try to get the mentor to come out of the cabin and rescue her? Or does she try and fix this herself? Obviously, if she shouts out and gets the mentor to rescue her, she's going to get in trouble, right? Because the mentor told her not to do this thing. But in the end, the decision she makes is that she realizes that her ego isn't worth her own life. So she screams, the mentor races out, uses her magic to bring her down, and gives her a very sternly worded tirade about why she should listen to the mentor's instructions. Now again, there's so much I could talk about with these 6 steps, and I go into much more detail with this inside Plotting a Fantasy Novel. But one really vital thing to think about here is that if we go back to the goal sets up the scene question. So in the case of our example, it is, will our protagonist learn to use this spell of flight? And then when we get to the resolution, that answers the scene question. Now, if you want to write a great plot that really keeps readers gripped and engaged, then you want to avoid answering the scene question with an easy yes. It is much better to answer the scene question with a yes, but. So yes, the character gets the thing they want, but now there is a new problem to deal with. Or answer the scene question with a no and furthermore. No, the character does not get the thing they wanted, and furthermore, they now have this new struggle that they're dealing with. When you use yes but or no and furthermore answers, it helps you instantly raise new complications and new questions. And that makes your readers want to read on to know what happens next. Now, you'll notice that a key part of this scene structure here is the dilemma. A lot of new fantasy writers make a crucial mistake with this, which brings me to the 4th big plot mistake that I see all the time. To explain this 4th plot mistake, let's imagine your protagonist is trying to decide between being a selfish, lazy slob versus training as a warrior. The thing is, that's kind of a weak choice. Why? Well, because you've given us a simple good versus evil choice. Good versus evil choices are generally a mistake because they're just not that complex. A more interesting choice would be trying to force your character to decide between 2 goods. So on one hand, your character wants to become a warrior to go off into the army and to protect his nation from an enemy force. On the other hand, if he becomes a warrior, it means he's going to leave behind his wife and his newborn son, which could be pretty devastating for them if he dies. That choice is much more interesting, right? Because there are good things on either side of that. Or you could give us an evil versus evil choice. For instance, does your protagonist burn down an innocent village to potentially flush out an evil enemy vampire? Or does your protagonist leave the village intact, potentially risking the lives of everyone in his army when night falls and the vampire comes out? Fundamentally, plot exists to force your characters to make increasingly tough choices, to reveal and sometimes change their true natures. So whenever you can give us a good versus good choice or an evil versus evil choice, it puts much more pressure on your characters and forces them to make more interesting, more revealing decisions. The fifth big plot mistake that I see new fantasy writers make all the time is trying to end every single chapter on a cliffhanger. Cliffhangers are an incredibly useful way to build suspense and make readers keep reading. To give an example of the cliffhanger, maybe your character comes home and she sees that her door is broken. There's someone waiting for her inside. If you cut the chapter off right there, you develop tremendous suspense. It's very hard for the reader to resist wanting to flip the page and seeing what happens next. And especially in your opening few chapters, I really recommend that you do try to bring in cliffhangers because I find that a really effective technique to pull readers into your story and get them quickly immersed and quickly connected with your characters. But if you try to end every single chapter in your story with a cliffhanger, your plot is probably going to suffer. Why is that? Well, cliffhangers are a form of negative anticipation. So with negative anticipation, something goes wrong and readers develop a sense of anxiety and dread, which then encourages them to keep reading. Now, again, that is tremendously useful, and at times that is exactly what you want to do in your plot. But if you do it too much, it can wear readers out. And that is why you want to occasionally end your chapters by using positive anticipation instead. So positive anticipation is all about excitement. So for instance, oh wow, we're finally going to see someone ride their dragon for the very first time in this story. Or curiosity, like, oh wow, we've heard so many stories and rumors and myths about this character, and now we're finally getting to meet them. So in practice, it's really good in your story just to have a balance between positive and negative anticipation. If you're just relying on negative anticipation all the time, that can get exhausting. So sprinkle in a bit of positive anticipation as well. The sixth big plot mistake to avoid in your fantasy novel is giving us bad subplots. Okay, so what actually makes a subplot bad? Well, let's imagine that you're writing a story about a tyrannical sentient dragon that has taken over a city. Your main plot follows your protagonist and her allies as they attempt to overthrow the dragon and restore peace. Now, let's imagine you have a subplot where we've got a side character and he spends several chapters practicing for and then competing in a chess tournament. More than likely, that subplot is going to suck. And probably when you just heard me say it then, you were a bit like, wait, what? What relevance does that have within this story? And if you had that reaction, then you are on exactly the right path because this subplot doesn't really have anything to do with the central core of this story, which is all about, overthrowing this tyrannical ruler. And because this subplot doesn't really relate back to that core of the story in a meaningful way, it just feels distracting. It feels like filler. And whenever we are in that subplot, we're probably going to be quite bored by it, just wanting to return to what the story is actually about. So how can you actually write better subplots? Well, first of all, I think it's really useful if you can first understand your story's theme. So I explain this in much more detail inside Plotting Your Fantasy Novel. I've got a whole chapter in there about finding your story's theme. But broadly speaking, I like to break my theme down into my thematic statement and my thematic question. So looking at this dragon story example here, the thematic statement might be, tyranny can only be overcome by brutal violence, never by peaceful means. And then the thematic question might be, what moral price are you willing to pay to overthrow tyranny? Now, one thing that's really important to keep in mind here is I don't think about the theme as like a message that you're trying to preach to readers here. I think that readers find that really tiresome and it usually doesn't produce good stories. The way I think about theme is that it presents this kind of philosophical idea that is really difficult to grapple with. And throughout your story, you're going to see different characters have different interpretations of this theme. So you're going to have some characters who are like, yes, it's okay to use violence to overthrow our tyrannical dragon ruler. And you're going to have other characters go, no, if we do that, that makes us just as bad as the dragon. And that is how you develop philosophical complexity in your story. Okay, so now that we have this theme, we can use it as a guide to make sure that our subplots feel connected to the core of the plot. So maybe we still go ahead with this chess competition subplot. And maybe we have a character who is kind of like an aristocrat. He's maybe, of the upper crust of this society, and he meets up with his friends every week as part of a chess club. And he notices that the other members of this chess club, who are all kind of, intellectual upper class types, despite their considerable resources, they're doing nothing to try and stop the dragon's tyranny and the dragon's oppression. As long as the dragon lets them keep their mansions and keep making money from their different businesses, they don't mind about the fact that the dragon is enslaving people to work in the gold mines, for instance. This infuriates our side character. So, during the chess tournament, when he knows that all the members of the club are going to be distracted and all going to be away from their mansions, he gets other members of the resistance to go out to their manors and blow them up and make it look like it was the dragon that attacked them. This then spurs the other chess club members into action. Do you see here how it just took a few tweaks to make this seemingly disconnected subplot far more cohesive with the overall story? The seventh big plot mistake that new fantasy writers make is not knowing what to do in the middle of your story. I talk to so many fantasy writers who have fantastic ideas for their beginnings and amazing ideas for their endings, but they don't really know what to do in this sort of yawning chasm of the middle of their story. And if you've ever found yourself in that situation, you might find that once you get past those opening few chapters in your book, writing becomes really challenging. You become less motivated, you don't really know what to do next, and it just feels like you're slamming your head against a brick wall. The best solution I've found for this, after publishing my fantasy books and after working with so many writers, is to use 9-point story structure. This gives you useful structural anchor points for each 1/8 of your story. And what I really like about this structural system is that it merges both the internal and external journey of your characters into this cohesive whole. I talk about this structure extensively in Plotting Your Fantasy Novel. The section talking about this particular story structure currently goes for about 50,000 words long in my manuscript. So there's a lot of detail in there. And again, if you want to be on the waitlist to be emailed when the book is ready, just go to jedherne.com/plot. But over the next few minutes, I want to just give you a brief overview of this structure here. And as we do this, I'll give examples of how this structure is applied to Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which I think is probably the best plotted Harry Potter book. So our first structural moment is the opening hook. This is where you introduce your protagonist with a defining moment that establishes why we should actually care about them. And ideally, you use this to show their flaws, their desires, and the rough direction of the character arc we can expect from them. So in the opening hook of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, we meet Harry Potter, who is a 13-year-old orphan wizard who hates summer holidays and has to do his homework in secret because he lives with the miserable Dursleys. In the first chapter of this book, Harry gets birthday letters from his friends, and his letter from Ron includes a newspaper article where it shows how Ron's family has won this lottery, and there's a picture of them on holiday in Egypt. And in the picture, Harry can see Ron's pet rat Scabbers on his shoulder. Now, remember that detail because that pays off later. This opening hook shows Harry in a relatively passive light. Because it's the third book in a series, it's mostly just doing a lot of recapping, reminding us of the world and the characters here. However, it does build a lot of empathy between us and Harry because it shows how horrible the Dursleys are and it shows how much Harry misses his friends, which is very relatable. Our second structural moment is the inciting incident. This is where you disturb your protagonist's ordinary world by presenting them with a challenge or invitation, which forces them onto some kind of journey. In the case of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, this happens when Harry's horrible Aunt Marge comes to stay with the Dursleys. When Marge insults Harry's dead parents, Harry loses his temper and he magically inflates her using a spell, which then leads to him fleeing from the Dursley household. He's really worried that he's about to get expelled from Hogwarts by illegally using magic as an underage wizard. So he runs away into the dark streets where he notices a black dog watching him, which causes him to trip over, accidentally summoning the Night Bus, this kind of magical transportation for wizards, which takes him to Diagon Alley. There, he bumps into the Minister of Magic and he thinks he's going to get expelled, but for some reason the Minister doesn't expel Harry. He just says that he's relieved to find him in one piece and that Harry has to spend the rest of his summer in Diagon Alley, which is more than fine by Harry. Now, on that trip aboard the Night Bus, Harry reads a newspaper article talking about the escaped convict Sirius Black, who is described as one of Voldemort's most loyal supporters. Our next structural moment is entering the new realm. So this is where your protagonist crosses some kind of threshold and steps into a new world where the rules are different. What's key here is that at this point, there's no real turning back to their ordinary life. So with Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, this happens where, right before leaving to Hogwarts, Harry hears this story about how Sirius Black in his sleep at Azkaban kept muttering, "He's at Hogwarts. He's at Hogwarts," when he was sleeping. And so Harry kind of puts the pieces together that Sirius Black, who was a huge supporter of Voldemort, wants Harry dead. Then on the train to Hogwarts, Dementors attack, causing Harry to hear screams and pass out. He is only saved thanks to the efforts of Professor Lupin, the new teacher. Harry then learns that the Ministry for Magic has sent the Dementors to Hogwarts to guard the school against Sirius Black. And this brings all sorts of new anxieties to this previously safe haven. This moment kind of fundamentally changes Harry's relationship with Hogwarts and introduces the Dementors as key antagonists for Harry to overcome, which then transitions us into Act 2 of the story. Our fourth structural moment is the rising danger point. So this is all about giving your antagonist an opportunity to show their threat and show why they're such a danger to your protagonist. In the case of The Prisoner of Azkaban, this happens when Sirius Black slashes the portrait of the Fat Lady, which is the living portrait that sort of protects the Gryffindor common room where Harry and his friends sleep. And this really shows his threat because it proves that Sirius can infiltrate Hogwarts despite the Dementor guards. Then, during a Quidditch match, Harry sees a bunch of Dementors swarming onto the field, and it causes him to fall off his broom and black out. So here we're getting escalating threats both from Sirius Black infiltrating Hogwarts and from the Dementors, whose presence is now causing Harry to hear his mother's dying screams. Our fifth structural moment is the midpoint revelation. And this is all about having a sort of key turning point of personal insight. Here, your protagonist has an important epiphany about themselves or about the forces of antagonism they're facing, and often this will lead to them confronting a buried truth. In James Scott Bell's book, Write Your Novel from the Middle, he talks about how this midpoint revelation is all about giving your characters a mirror moment where they, figuratively or sometimes even literally look in the mirror and question who they are and who they are becoming. And this really forms kind of the central pivot point of a character arc. And the reason why this point is so important is because a great midpoint revelation is really the answer to what do I do in the middle of my story? It gives you this really clear signpost to work towards. So in the case of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, our midpoint revelation happens when Harry eavesdrops on a conversation in Hogsmeade between the Minister for Magic, a couple of teachers, and also Madame Rosemerta, who is the proprietor of a pub there. And he basically learns that Sirius Black and his father were best friends when they were at Hogwarts, and that Sirius Black was actually Harry's own godfather. Sirius Black even served as Lily and James Potter's secret keeper, so basically he was involved in this spell that was designed to protect them from Voldemort. But Sirius Black then betrayed them to Voldemort, allowing him to come and murder Harry's parents. When their other friend, Peter Pettigrew, confronted Sirius after, Sirius blew Peter to smithereens, along with a bunch of Muggle bystander witnesses, and the only thing they found of Peter was a finger. This brings us to the sixth structural moment, deepening pressure. So here, again, this is an antagonist-centric moment, and it's all about using your antagonist to apply amplified pressure to your protagonist. If your protagonist has sort of been growing or evolving over the course of your story, this is where the antagonist comes in and says, oh, are you really going to stick to those new beliefs? Oh, are you really going to follow that new worldview you've been developing? Or are you going to regress back as soon as I apply some pressure? And this pressure from the antagonist often forces your main character into this kind of rock bottom, dark night of the soul moment where they have maximum despair and everything seems lost. In the case of Prisoner of Azkaban, this happens when Ron wakes up in the Gryffindor common room one night, only to see that Sirius Black is standing above him with a knife. Though Ron escapes unharmed after Sirius flees, this near miss shows how close Sirius came to killing Harry. Although Harry does wonder why Sirius, who killed all these innocent bystanders to murder Peter Pettigrew years ago, why didn't Sirius just kill Ron and then move on to Harry? Curious. Shortly after this, we learn that Hagrid's beloved hippogriff, Buckbeak, will be condemned for execution by the Ministry of Magic after he attacked Malfoy earlier in the story. This plunges Harry, Ron, and Hermione into a lot of grief and despair. Our seventh structural point is the final spark. So this is where, just when everything seems lost, your protagonist encounters a key realization or a clue that provides the final puzzle piece needed to defeat the antagonist, which makes them set course for the final climactic confrontation. So just in the same way that the entering the new realm moment was all about transitioning from Act 1 into Act 2 of the story, the final spark is all about transitioning from Act 2 into Act 3 of your book. And the core function here is really just to set them on course for the final climactic sequence of your book. Sometimes characters know that they're going on that final climactic sequence. In other cases, they're not really going to realize it until they're fully ensnared there, which is the case in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. So in the case of this book, as exams end, Hagrid writes to Harry and his friends that Buckbeak's appeal has failed and that his execution is scheduled for sundown. Harry immediately declares that despite Hagrid saying they should stay up in the castle, no, we have to go down and we have to support Hagrid. And while Harry doesn't realize it in the moment, this decision is going to trigger the final climactic confrontation of this book with Sirius Black and the Dementors. So it pushes him over the threshold between Act 2 and Act 3 of the story. This brings us to the climax. So this is the final confrontation between your protagonist and your antagonist, resolving the core conflict of your story. Now, you'll see these rough percentage markers above this timeline here. They are just very rough guidelines. You're going to see some stories deviate from these timelines more than others, but also you're going to see that some plot points, like the climax, for instance, are not just going to be like one thing that just takes place at the 75% mark of the story. In the case of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the climactic sequence from where Harry and his friends go down to Hagrid's hut to when things are fully resolved with Sirius and the Dementors, that stretches probably from like the 76% mark to like the 96% mark of the story. And I would say that whole thing is kind of the climax, which is very different pacing-wise to the rest of the book, because the rest of the book takes place over a few months, but this climactic sequence, even though it's like a quarter of the book, takes place only in a couple of hours. So to get a bit more specific about what actually happens in the climax here with Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, at Hagrid's hut, Harry, Ron, and Hermione are surprised to find Scabbers, who is Ron's rat, who they thought was dead. They leave the hut as the executioner arrives to kill Buckbeak, only for the black dog that Harry has been seeing all year to attack them, to grab Ron and drag him away. Harry and Hermione follow, and they're shocked to discover that the black dog is actually Sirius Black, who is an animagus who can turn into an animal. They also discover that their teacher, Professor Lupin, is a werewolf and used to be friends with Sirius when they were all at school together. We learn that Scabbers, Ron's pet rat, is actually Peter Pettigrew, disguising himself in rat form. Peter is the real betrayer of Harry's parents. He is the one that betrayed them to Voldemort, which led to their death. So Sirius and Lupin, they want to kill Peter Pettigrew. And Harry, he wanted to kill Sirius earlier in the book. And yet, Harry gets them to spare Pettigrew, which shows his growth as a character. But, of course, things aren't over yet. As they leave, Dementors attack Harry and Sirius. The Dementors are going to suck their souls out. But then Harry sees a familiar figure cast a Patronus, which is this charm that dispels the Dementors. Harry has been struggling to try and learn this all year. And despite all reason, Harry thinks that this figure is his father. Harry then blacks out. He wakes up only to discover that Sirius Black, despite being innocent, is about to be executed effectively. But he is able to use Hermione's time turner, which is this time-traveling device that she's secretly been using all year to attend classes, to go back in time and basically go to the lake where the Dementors almost killed him and Sirius. And Harry's going there to basically try and see his father because he thinks his father was the one that came to save them. But as the time approaches and the Dementors are about to suck out Sirius and Harry's souls, he realizes, oh no, it wasn't my father I saw, it was me.
Expecto Patronum!
And so despite struggling with the Patronus charm all year, Harry steps up, casts the spell, and saves his former self, finally conquering his fear of Dementors. He's then able to rescue Buckbeak from execution and then use Buckbeak to free Sirius, allowing them to fly off into the night. So this brings us to the ninth and final structural point, which is the closing image. This is all about providing closure by showing the transformed protagonist in their new reality, contrasting with the opening image of your story to show how much your main character has changed or evolved, whether for good or bad. In the case of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, we see Harry riding home on the train with his friends. And while he's riding home, he gets a letter from Sirius, who, as his godfather, finally gives Harry permission to visit Hogsmeade, something he's been wanting to have official permission for all year, although it certainly hasn't stopped him sneaking out there. And now Harry has gone from a place of not really having like a father figure in his life to having Sirius, which brings him a lot of warmth and happiness. Again, there's a lot more detail and nuance to using 9-point story structure effectively, which is why I wrote a whole book about plotting. So if you want to be on that waiting list to be emailed as soon as the book comes out, just go to jedherne.com/plot. The eighth big plot mistake I see new fantasy writers make all the time is only doing one thing in each scene. Mediocre scenes just do one thing. For instance, oh, I'm going to use this scene to explain how my magic system works. The problem here is that often makes your scenes feel very artificial or forced. Readers can see that you're trying to tell them something, and that makes them feel bored. By comparison, the best scenes do multiple things at once. For instance, I'm going to use this scene to explain my magic system, but I'm also going to use it to set up a rivalry between my protagonist and another student who is learning the same magic. And then I'll also show the eccentric personality of the wizard who is actually teaching them. And in the background, I'm also going to foreshadow that the neighboring country is on the brink of declaring war on my protagonist's homeland. This blended approach is so powerful. By feeding multiple purposes into your scene, it's going to make them feel so much more natural and lively. And that's because you're going to be able to progress both your plot, characters, world building, and theme all at the same time. So the reader's not going to think, oh, this is just the scene where I'm getting lectured about the world's history. Not at all. Having multiple purposes, having multiple things you're trying to do in the one scene, it removes any hint of supposed to. And that allows the reader to fully immerse themselves in your story. The ninth big plot mistake to avoid is not showing enough regular signs of progress. A sign of progress is any moment where we see your story move closer to the promised payoff. For instance, in Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, we follow the famed mercenary Monza Mikado as she tries to get revenge by killing the 7 men who betrayed her and murdered her brother. So that's the story's promise. Is she going to be able to get revenge and kill these 7 men? So as the book progresses and she begins to kill some of these people, we feel a sense of progression towards that promise. We're getting clear signs of progress with each murder. By comparison, imagine if the first 90% of that story just showed Monza kind of setting up and preparing for that revenge. And then in the last 10%, she killed those 7 people. It could work, but it probably wouldn't feel as well paced and it wouldn't really feel quite as satisfying because you're not really giving us regular drip-fed signs of progress throughout the story. And what I've found with my writing is that readers need regular breadcrumbs of progress to keep them motivated and engaged. That's why it's so critical to ask yourself, and ideally with every single chapter you write, you ask yourself this question of what has actually changed by the end of this chapter compared to the start. Whatever it is, give us regular signs of progress and we're going to keep reading your story. Now, the 10th plot mistake I'm about to explain is a big reason why you read some stories and it just feels like their plot is really jerky and uneven. To explain this mistake, let's imagine that in chapter 19 of your story, your characters are wandering across the country and they begin talking about dragons. They've never talked about dragons earlier in the book. You never even mentioned dragons, but you basically have the characters discussing, oh, do you think dragons exist? Oh, no, don't be preposterous. Dragons don't exist. That's just an absolute myth. And then in chapter 20, they meet a dragon. Now, on paper, encountering a dragon, especially when people think it's just a myth, that should be amazing, right? Well, more likely than not, that scene is going to fall flat. You only set up this detail, you only foreshadowed the dragons in the previous chapter. We never got any mentions of dragons beforehand. As a result, it all feels awfully convenient. The characters just started chatting about dragons and then boom, here be dragons. So what's the mistake here? The big mistake here is that there wasn't enough gap between setup and payoff. This is an extremely common issue I noticed amongst discovery writers. I totally understand why. When you're just making up a story as you go along, it's very easy to think, oh, this would be a really cool direction to go in, and then you just go there straight away without enough foreshadowing to kind of set that up. And in your first draft, that can be fine. But when you edit, you need to find ways to pull your setups earlier. So if we take our dragon example, this would be so much more compelling if the characters are kind of discussing dragons way back in chapter 3 or chapter 2. That gives us enough time to sort of plant the seed of doubt in our own minds. We can go, oh, they're talking about dragons. I'm reading a fantasy story, but I'm not seeing any dragons. Okay, so do dragons actually exist, or is this just a kind of a myth that exists in this world? I'm not sure. There's this open loop that's in the reader's mind. And then as you progress with the story, they're going to kind of forget about that, right? There's going to be other things that distract their attention. Then when you hit the dragon in chapter 20, it's going to be this amazing moment. You're like, oh, now I understand why they were talking about that all the way back in chapter 3. So the reveal lands with much more payoff simply by dragging that gap wider between setup and payoff. The next big plot mistake is an extremely common one. I've seen it from so many writers, and while it comes from a place of good intentions, it's going to make readers really annoyed with you. To explain this mistake, let's imagine that in chapter 5 of your story, we see our protagonist, whose name is May, finally get to this magical sanctuary. She's been hunted by the Imperial soldiers, but she's finally in this magical sanctuary, and the borders of this sanctuary mean that she's safe there for now. Then, in chapters 6 through to 9, we switch to the point of view of May's brother, Leo. And in those chapters, we see Leo frantically searching the city for her, really terrified that the Imperial soldiers have captured and executed her. So this leads Leo to sneak into the Imperial palace, interrogate people, and feel a tremendous amount of anxiety because he's terrified that May has been executed. But then in chapter 9, he gets a letter from May where she says, actually, no, I managed to escape. I've been hiding in a sanctuary in the forest. I'm all good. More than likely, chapters 6 to 9 with Leo are going to be extremely boring. Why is that? Well, those chapters, they're trying to create tension by making us worried that May is dead, by putting us in Leo's perspective and making us concerned that she has been executed. But we already know that May is perfectly safe because at the end of chapter 5, she got to the sanctuary. In other words, we already know the answer to the central question that is driving Leo's actions. So his conflict feels hollow because there's no genuine consequence or possibility of finding anything meaningful out about May's whereabouts that we don't already know. The only real consequence or worry we might have, I guess, is the concern that Leo might get into danger himself as he searches for May. But if he makes it through those chapters unscathed, only to then get the letter from May saying, "I'm in the sanctuary," we're just going to be there thinking, what was the point? What was the point of reading that? And so that's why this 11th plot mistake is creating false tension. False tension occurs when you create a scene that is not genuinely loaded with consequence, and as a result, the conflict falls flat. Make sure that whatever conflict you're exploring has genuine consequence attached to it. A metaphor to think about this is if readers can see your character walking over a tightrope and they can see that the ground is only 2 feet below the tightrope, they're not going to be worried about the character falling. But if they see that the ground is 100 feet below the tightrope, now they're going to be really stressed. The 12th big plot mistake that you have to really avoid in your fantasy novel is weak antagonists. Your antagonist is a vital driver of your plot, and that is because they are responsible for providing the challenges and the conflict that your main character has to overcome. A weak antagonist equals a weak story, but a well-designed antagonist is going to push your main character to their limits, forcing them to grow, forcing them to make difficult choices, and in other words, forcing them to be far more interesting, which in turn makes your plot more compelling as well. The biggest tip I have for writing great fantasy antagonists is this: design your antagonist to be uniquely gifted at targeting your main character's specific weaknesses. This allows you to make your protagonist an underdog, which is really vital if you want to have a lot of suspense and tension in your story. For instance, maybe your protagonist is a trained military leader. He is an expert fighter on the battlefield, he has the respect of his men, he's a very good leader, he's a very good tactician. How could you design an antagonist to attack his unique weaknesses? Well, one approach is you could have him go up against a stronger military general. That could work, but that's maybe not the most compelling direction. A more interesting direction would be to use your antagonist to attack the main character in a way that they haven't trained for. So maybe your antagonist is a sly politician. She certainly doesn't have your protagonist's military skills. She can't swing a sword, she can't lead an army, but our protagonist just isn't equipped for her cunning schemes or her ability to weaponize politics or public opinion. In other words, she's not fighting him with swords, which would be a clash between equals. She's fighting him with words, which firmly puts him in the camp of being an underdog. That is going to create massive adversity for our protagonist and really force him to grow. Now, there are 7 big antagonist mistakes that I see new fantasy writers make all the time. I explain these in this video, and it's worth watching because it's going to help you design the perfect antagonist for your story's plot. Keep writing and keep striving, and I'll see you in the next video.